This video is going through the details of photosynthesis. We're going to just dive right in to exactly how the process works. Whereas in the introduction video, we just kind of briefly hit on what is photosynthesis. So, photosynthesis has two parts, light-dependent reactions and light-independent reactions. In the light-dependent reactions, there are two more sets. So if you think about an umbrella, and the umbrella is photosynthesis, under that umbrella you have light-dependent and light-independent. And then underneath light-dependent, you have photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. It is important to note that photosystem 2 comes before photosystem 1 because of the order in which they were discovered. It was just too complicated to go back and say, well, photosystem 1, we found this one later, but it actually came first, so we've stuck with it, and photosystem 2 was discovered second, but it comes before photosystem 1. The light-dependent reactions, both photosystems together, work to capture and transfer energy. Their whole goal is to take energy from the sun, or a photon, and make it into chemical energy called glucose. That's the end product of the light-dependent and light-independent reactions together, is to make glucose. But we have to have this kind of intermediate step. We can't just take a photon of light and produce it into a sugar just instantly. So we have light-dependent reactions first. So chlorophyll and all other light-absorbing molecules capture that energy from the sun. A water molecule is split, so you know that our reactants, the things that we put into photosynthesis, are carbon dioxide and water. And we add sunlight to water, and that water molecule splits. It makes hydrogen for electrons, and oxygen is a waste product. ATP and NADPH are created, and like we talked about in the ATP-ADP cycle, energy is stored within the ATP molecule because we break that third phosphate off and we release energy. Well, we didn't talk about NADPH, and we're not going to even go over what NADPH stands for because it's such a crazy long word. But NADPH is another type of energy storage molecule. And I want you to pay close attention to the P in that, because when we go over cellular respiration, we'll talk about a chemical that's very similar. But just remember, photosynthesis has NADPH. But energy is stored inside of the bonds of those two molecules. And we have what we call an electron transport chain that pumps hydrogen ions into the thylakoid, which is what allows us to make ATP and NADPH. And so we're not going to go over in great gory detail, but basically the sun will hit the chlorophyll molecule, excite electrons in that. It will go through a series of electron transport chains in the thylakoid, which is just a series of proteins that transfer electrons and capture energy and put it into chemical bonds. And then you take those two, ATP and NADPH, and put them into the second part, the light-independent reactions, to then use that energy and make glucose. So we're not going to go into gory detail on exactly how this happens. I just want you to know that ATP, NADPH are created because we store energy in bonds. Water molecules are split. We capture sunlight, and we use an electron transport chain, and it happens within the thylakoid. So why are these so important? Light-dependent reactions use sunlight to make that NADPH and the ATP. So that's kind of what I was just saying. They're using their water that comes in and the sunlight that comes in to make ATP and NADPH, which store energy in their bonds. and we also give off oxygen as a waste. I know it kind of sounds counterintuitive to think about oxygen as being a waste molecule, but when you break down when you break down water, H2O, and you use the H's, you don't have a use for the oxygen, so it's given off as waste. Another way to remember this would be you breathe in oxygen, which is put out by the plants. So you know, because everybody's all in a tizzy about it all the time, the more trees you cut down, the more pollution that we have in the air. That's because of this photosynthetic reaction. We're taking water and using sunlight to make oxygen. So if we were to cut down every tree on the whole of planet Earth, then we wouldn't have oxygen being given off as a waste. The only thing that we would be able to use would be something like the grass to make oxygen, and it just wouldn't be sufficient to sustain the human population. Moving to the light-independent reactions. Based on the word, they do not require light. They are also called the Calvin cycle. So light-independent means no light, and it takes place in the stroma. And remember, the stroma is kind of like the cytoplasm, but within the chloroplast. It uses ATP and NADPH, so it takes those products of the light-dependent reactions and puts them into the Calvin cycle in order to produce sugar. We have more NADPH created as a result of the light-independent reactions. We're just creating more of those energy storage molecules that can be broken down and made into energy. We also use the enzyme called ATP Synthase. You kind of know it's an enzyme because of those three letters ASE on the end. And ATP Synthase makes ATP from ADP by adding a third phosphate to the molecule. A little more on the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is carbon dioxide, which we add 2 to create a 6-carbon molecule. So CO2 has 1 C in it. But if I have 6 molecules of CO2, we have 6 carbons. So we take those carbon dioxide molecules. Remember, your equation is carbon dioxide plus water, so you already used the water. So here in the light-independent reactions, you're using the carbon dioxide to make a 6-carbon molecule. That 6-carbon molecule is broken into 2 3-carbon molecules. So instead of 6 C's lined up, we have 3 C's lined up, but we have 2 of those. So we still have 6 carbons. That 3-carbon molecule exits the whole Calvin cycle. 2 is waste, and 1 that has enough energy to go through the cycle again to make glucose. We put a little energy in to create a 5-carbon molecule and start the whole cycle over again. So we put a 3-carbon molecule in, and then we ultimately go around this cycle a couple of times and create a glucose molecule. So we start with 6, we break it down into 3, 2 leave as waste, and 1 leaves with enough energy to make glucose. Important things to remember: light-independent reactions happen in the stroma of the chloroplast. Again, that's like that cytoplasmy area of the chloroplast. They do not require sunlight. These can continue even in the absence of sunlight. So that's how you have plants that survive when sunlight's fairly limited. Certain times a year, the plant can still survive even when you don't have as much sunlight, because these light-independent reactions, these glucose-producing reactions, can happen as long as they've gotten enough light during the day. They use the products of the light-dependent reactions, ATP and NADPH, and it uses carbon dioxide to make glucose. And again, it takes multiple turns of that Calvin cycle to make a single sugar molecule.